Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for logging on today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the countervailing duty law, or CVD law, what it is, where it comes from, and raise for consideration some of the challenges we are now facing where the CVD law needs to be applied. And before diving in, just in case it needs to be said, if you are from a state that makes absolutely anything, this should be important to you because the odds are those producers in your state are competing for business with imports. And if those imports are benefiting from unfair subsidies, there's a very real risk that our US producer will not be able to compete. I'm not trying to tell you all subsidies are bad. It's only when a subsidy becomes trade distorting that we get involved. And trade distorting subsidies have been an issue that Congress has been trying to address for a long time. In fact, the CVD law was passed in 1897, making it the first US legislation addressing unfair trade practices. Back then, the law addressed the provision of bounties and grants. Luckily, it's gotten less piratey over the years. The CVD law can now be found under Title VII of the Tariff Act of 1930. It is administered by the Commerce Department, and in 1994, consistent with the WTO agreement, Congress updated the law, establishing that for a subsidy to be considered countervailable, Commerce must find it to be three things. First, it must provide a financial contribution by a government authority. Second, it must convey a benefit. And third, that benefit must be specific. Now, the law goes on to define each of these three factors, but instead of reading to you from the statute, I'd like to share an example. Softwood lumber from Canada, for instance. What's happening there? Well, US lumber producers purchase stumpage, which is a fancy word for trees, from private companies at market rates. However, they are competing with Canadian imports of lumber, and in Canada, lumber producers purchase their stumpage from the government. And so the question becomes, what should that stumpage cost? And was the Canadian government providing stumpage to lumber producers below that price? Now here's the thing. The world has changed since 1994, when the law was last meaningfully updated. Governments have gotten creative with their subsidies, and that has thrown some challenges at the CVD law. Some of these challenges we believe can be addressed by the current law, but we are seeing a reluctance from Commerce to take action. For example, the world is full of huge multinational corporations. Could a subsidy they receive in one country impact their business in another country? Absolutely. Congress actually added a provision to the CVD law in 1988 to address the concern that US manufacturers are confronted by unfair competition from international consortia receiving subsidies from multiple foreign governments. It's the Airbus example. Specifically, Airbus subsidiaries across the EU were receiving subsidies for the parts and pieces of the airplane made in that EU member nation. Under this provision, Commerce was able to collapse its subsidy analysis, so the consortium members were treated as one company for the purpose of determining the level of subsidization attributable to the final airplane. Since 1988, Commerce has only applied this provision 2 to 3 times. Most recently in the 2017 large civil aircraft from Canada case. That can't be because it's not happening. Now more than ever, it's very possible that while a company is headquartered in country A, it has production facilities in countries X, Y, and Z, and is receiving trade distorting subsidies from any and all of those governments. We're also seeing countries with vast national industrial policies, the scale of which were not contemplated in 1994. And frankly, Commerce has been slow to respond. For example, the Korean government is subsidizing its electricity industry. Korea runs its electricity program by cross-subsidizing individual ratepayers for political goodwill. What do I mean by that? In a recent case, Commerce asked the government party point blank, shouldn't you be charging your industrial users more if you are giving discounts to your citizens and the agricultural sector? And the answer was yes. If the government admits it should be charging more, that's a textbook countervailable subsidy. But we have been litigating this issue for years, and Commerce has only now begun to calculate a countervailable subsidy because the Korean electricity provider is operating at record losses across the board. Sometimes Congress has stepped in. For example, after China acceded to the WTO, it started receiving the benefit of most favored nation status. What does that mean? Lower general customs duties. So, not surprisingly, China being export-oriented and all, imports from China started to surge. And it was at that point that the US began applying the CVD law to China. Now, this raised all sorts of questions regarding the applicability of the CVD law to a non-market economy country, and Congress stepped in and provided clear direction to Commerce that the CVD law was to be applied to China. Now, China has gotten very clever with its subsidies. China is no longer only subsidizing industries within China, but under its Belt and Road Initiative, China is subsidizing industries in third countries. For example, let's look at a recent case from the EU. What happened there? Well, China set up a special economic zone in Egypt, where it funneled subsidies into a company producing glass fiber fabrics. Those glass fiber fabrics were then imported into the EU from Egypt. The European industry brought a countervailing duty case against Egypt, and they claimed that the subsidies the Egyptian manufacturer was receiving from China should be found countervailable. And the European Commission agreed and calculated a countervailing duty rate of 13.1%. Well, the Egyptian industry appealed this decision, claiming the EU was wrong to countervail the subsidies provided by China, aka not by the Egyptian government. So what happened? The EU General Court just upheld that original decision to countervail the Chinese subsidies. They found that subsidies granted by a foreign state to companies in a third country are countervailable as attributable to the government of that third country. Now, if this case had been brought by a US industry, Commerce would have calculated a 0% subsidy rate under the same facts, China subsidizing the industry in Egypt. Because the US CVD law has never been used to address this situation, meaning the US producer in your state cannot get relief from this fact pattern under US law. Now, as John was just mentioning, and it's my understanding that Congress is now considering the Level the Playing Field 2.0 bill, which features a provision on cross-border subsidies, a provision that would direct Commerce to remedy this situation. When introduced, the bill had bipartisan and bicameral support, and should it get passed, it would be beneficial to domestic industries and domestic workers in the communities they are located. Of course, this isn't the only challenge facing the CVD law. While we want to talk to you about strengthening the CVD law to address new, more modern types of subsidies, we're seeing some people trying to weaken the CVD law in the name of green subsidies. Now, the reality is that this is a complicated issue and definitely one that warrants more than my 15 minutes to cover, but let me just leave you with some food for thought. Many of these subsidies result in greener and cleaner production, which also leads to more efficient production. In that world, what distinguishes the green subsidy from a production subsidy? And in the event of a subsidy race, are we willing to become reliant on imports in the name of green subsidies at the expense of US industry and US jobs? So now that I've raised some questions for all of you, I think it's only fair that that I take some questions as well. So Mark, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. The first question I have, let me read it to you. It says, when the administration announced a 24-month tariff exemption on solar modules manufactured in Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, it also invoked the Defense Production Act in an effort to accelerate U.S. solar manufacturing. Have you or do you expect to see any benefit to U.S. companies from the DPA announcement, and does it have a broader application to other U.S. industries?
Thanks for that question. I apologize in advance. I'm going to offer what might not be the most popular opinion, but this may be a flawed policy perspective. And what do I mean by that? The idea that we in the US can out-subsidize the Chinese in their quest to dominate certain sectors of the economy is short-sighted and comes from a false premise that the US Treasury has unlimited funds. But to answer your specific question about the solar case, the DPA was invoked to subsidize purchases of US-made solar panels. But as the law firm that brought the solar circumvention case, we can attest that no US money has flowed to US solar manufacturers. Even if it did, however, the circumvention that we were trying to address is so damaging to US solar companies that many have already gone out of business, and no amount of DPA money can bring them back. And that's the issue with countering massive industrial subsidization policies with belated funding deals. In short, the CVD law needs to be applied as written and duties collected. And that's what levels the playing field, because this back and forth subsidy war really doesn't offer the same protection as just applying the CVD law.
Well, let me ask you then another question, which has been offered. It states, have U.S. producers found that once an order is in place that they remain effective, or are offshore competitors successful in diminishing their effectiveness? And then I think the second part is very important. It says, does U.S. industry have sufficient information through the trade remedy process to know if an order is being effectively enforced?
So at first, just keep in mind that just bringing a CVD case is time and resource intensive. They cost companies a lot of money and they take a lot of time to complete. And the fact of the matter is, these investigations largely target multinational corporations that have facilities in a number of countries. So shifts in the supply chain, as well as shifts in production risk, undermining the shifts in production risk undermining the effectiveness of an order. It is our job as the lawyers for the affected companies or workers to monitor the situation and make sure there are no gaps or holes in the orders, and there are various tools we use to do that. We use the administrative review process at Commerce. We use customs enforcement tools like e-allegations. But we also rely on publicly available ships manifest data, which provides some transparency in the shipment of goods, because the reality is that evasion and transshipment and circumvention happen. And we try our best to stop it when it does. To that end, I want to commend Senators Whitehouse and Cassidy for introducing the Manifest Modernization Act, which seeks to increase the transparency of shipping manifests by extending public disclosure requirements to aircraft, truck, and rail manifests. This is very important because a lot of the goods that enter the US enter through Mexico and Canada. And right now, Mexico is the only trading partner providing its data, whereas anything trucked across the border from Canada is not reported to the industry or parties in the trade. Hope that answers your question, Mark.